The cell membrane encloses the cell and regulates the passage of substances into and out of the cell. The cell has metabolic machinery in it, and we need the inside of the cell to be different than the outside of the cell so we can accomplish certain things. And that's going to be one of our themes in pharmacology. A signal is going to come from the outside of the cell to tell the inside of the cell to do something. All right, so that thing flashing is a phospholipid. So let's take a look at phospholipids. Unfortunately, the nomenclature is very simple. There is a phospho and a lipid. Phospholipids are the basic building blocks of all cell membranes. And so cell membranes are made up of phospholipids, a phospholipid bilayer. By the way, that phospholipid bilayer that you know that is the cell membrane, it also makes up the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi. The nuclear membrane is also made up of a phospholipid bilayer to make things even more complicated. So this phospholipid bilayer is more than just the cell membrane. There's stuff going on the inside of the cell that phospholipid bilayer is involved in. So there's my phosphate, the inorganic phosphate. They call it inorganic because carbon's not involved, which isn't fair because phosphate is certainly probably the most important part of an organic structure. We talked about that in the last lecture. It's very water-soluble, very water-loving. And there is my fat chain, and the zigzag lines, remember, are carbons, are bonds between carbons. And so I showed you a lipid chain. Okay. There we go. And there's that carboxylic acid. I showed you the biologic acid from, it was on an amino acid, and we can put it on a fat chain and end up with a fatty acid. And that's where fatty acids come from, putting acid groups on the end of fat chains. So if we take a phosphate, an inorganic phosphate, and two fatty acids and add a glycerol, which everyone misses on the quiz, then we have a phospholipid. Instead of putting the phosphate on the glycerol, we put a third lipid on that glycerol. What would we have? A triglyceride. But instead of making a triglyceride, we've made a phospholipid. Okay? And they'll draw it like this, or they'll draw it like that, or they'll draw it like that, or maybe they'll draw it like this. That's the simplest way to draw a phospholipid, and when you look in books, maybe they'll draw it this way. All right, here's the fun with phospholipids. The phosphate end of the phospholipid is very water-soluble, and in this class we call that hydrophilic, water-loving, or you can call it lipophobic, fat-insoluble, fat-hating. Right? So the phosphate end is very water-soluble. And the lipid end, of course, is very fat-soluble and avoids water. And so this is the key to phospholipid. This is the key to detergents as well. The neato coolio thing about putting phospholipids into water is that they spontaneously do something. The hydrophobic tails are attracted to each other. And so when they're in the water, the hydrophobic tails will protect each other from the water, and the phosphate groups will point out into the water. And so this is our phospholipid bilayer, the way I draw it, and you can see the phosphates and the lipid chains, and this fat center is the fat center of the membrane with phosphates pointing into the water. These form spontaneously in water, like these are called liposomes. If you put phospholipids into water, liposomes will be one of the things that form. So there's my cell membrane. Cell membranes are made of the phospholipid bilayer. I tend to repeat myself in here. And because of the lipid center of the bilayer, water-soluble substances will not pass through the membrane unless they are very tiny. Okay? And so special things have to happen to get water-soluble things across the membrane, like channels, protein channels that allow water-soluble things to pass through, protein machines that transport things across the membrane. And so this is what protects the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell, allows the inside of the cell to be different than the outside of the cell membrane. All right, because the water-soluble substances cannot pass spontaneously through the membrane, inside of the cell, the cytosol, the intracellular fluid, can be different than the outside of the cell, the extracellular fluid.